September 3rd, 1836. 11:47 p.m. Thunder ripped across the Mississippi sky as Caldwell stumbled behind the cotton gin, lantern swinging in his trembling hand. He'd been searching for Montgomery Harris for the past 20 minutes. The drunk was supposed to help with the midnight patrol, but no one had seen him since sundown. What Caldwell found made him drop the lantern. Montgomery Harris lay crumpled against the wooden frame of the gin, head tilted at an impossible angle, throat bearing the deep purple imprints of fingers, massive fingers, each mark the size of a silver dollar. His eyes were still open, frozen wide in absolute terror, staring at something only the dead could see. The whiskey bottle he'd been nursing lay shattered beside him, brown liquid mixing with mud and rain. Caldwell's scream cut through the storm. Within minutes, Thurston Gibbs arrived with 5 other overseers: Rutherford, Whitfield, Pemberton, Thornton, and Yates. They stood in a semicircle around Harris's corpse, weapons drawn, rain hammering their faces. Gibbs knelt beside the body, his cold gray eyes scanning the crushed windpipe, the finger marks that suggested inhuman strength. What in God's name could do this? Pemberton whispered, his rifle shaking in his hands. Gibbs stood slowly, water streaming from his hat. Not what? Who? He turned to face the darkness beyond the cotton gin, toward the slave quarters barely visible through the downpour. One of them finally snapped. "That's impossible," Rutherford said, though his voice lacked conviction. "They wouldn't dare. They know what happens when—" "Then explain those marks," Gibbs interrupted, pointing at Harris's throat. "Explain how a man gets strangled with bare hands and doesn't fire a single shot." He gestured to Harris's pistol, still holstered at his hip. "He never even drew his weapon. Whoever did this got close without raising suspicion." The overseers exchanged glances. They all understood what that meant. Harris had seen his killer, had recognized him, had considered him harmless right up until those hands closed around his throat. "We split up," Gibbs ordered. "Check every cabin, every field hand. Someone's missing from the quarters, guaranteed. When we find him, we make an example that'll be remembered for the next 50 years. The men nodded and began to disperse, but Gibbs grabbed Caldwell's arm. "Send riders to the neighboring plantations. Get every white man with a gun to Blackwood within the hour. If we've got an uprising starting, we crush it tonight." Caldwell ran toward the stables. Gibbs stared out into the rain-soaked darkness, his hand resting on the bullwhip coiled at his belt, the one he called Persuasion. Somewhere out there, one of Blackwood's 347 slaves had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. And Thurston Gibbs would personally ensure that crossing cost him everything. What none of them knew, what they couldn't possibly imagine as they hunted through the storm with their rifles and their dogs and their absolute certainty of white supremacy, was that they weren't the hunters. They were already dead men. By dawn, all 12 overseers would be corpses scattered across Blackwood Plantation. And the killer they were hunting would become a legend whispered in slave quarters from Mississippi to Virginia, a story that would haunt the South for generations. But to understand how one man killed 12 in a single night using nothing but his bare hands, we need to go back 6 months earlier, to the spring of 1836, when Blackwood Plantation was still operating at peak efficiency, and a 300-pound enslaved man named Moses still believed that submission could keep the people he loved safe. He was wrong. And that mistake would transform him from a beast of burden into the most lethal force Mississippi had ever seen, a titan whose vengeance would shake the foundations of slavery itself and prove that oppression, no matter how brutal, always has limits. Before we continue with Moses's story, hit that subscribe button. This channel uncovers the forgotten stories of resistance and rebellion that history tried to bury. The tales they didn't want you to know. If you believe these voices deserve to be heard, Join us. And drop a comment telling me, how far would you go to protect the people you love? Now, let's go back to where it all began, to the empire of cruelty known as Blackwood Plantation, and to the man who would bring it all crashing down. Spring, 1836. 6 months before the blood. Blackwood Plantation stretched across 4,000 acres of Adams County, Mississippi, 8 miles north of Natchez, a distance that might as well have been an ocean separating two different worlds. Natchez was civilization, commerce, genteel society. Blackwood was something else entirely. It was a machine designed for one purpose: extracting maximum profit from human flesh. 347 enslaved people worked that land. 12 white overseers controlled them. And at the center of it all, in a gleaming white mansion with towering columns that caught the morning sun like a monument to wealth, lived Cornelius and Prudence Blackwood, third-generation plantation aristocracy who'd inherited their empire and expanded it into one of the most profitable cotton operations in the entire South. The numbers told a story that polite society preferred not to examine too closely. Cotton was selling at 15 cents per pound in New Orleans that spring. Blackwood produced 1,200 bales annually. Do the mathematics, and you're looking at roughly $90,000 in revenue. A fortune built entirely on the labor of people who would never see a single penny. But here's what the plantation owners understood that most people today don't. The economics of slavery weren't just immoral. They were calculated with cold precision. It was cheaper to work an enslaved person to death and purchase a replacement from the Natchez slave markets than to provide adequate food, medical care, or rest. A healthy young man sold for $800. A woman of childbearing age went for $700. If you could extract 3 years of brutal labor before they died or became too broken to work, you'd already profited. Everything after that was pure gain. The Natchez markets thrived on this mathematics. Every Tuesday and Saturday, auctioneers stood on wooden platforms selling human beings like livestock. Families were separated. Children torn from mothers. Husbands sold away from wives. And the Blackwood Plantation had standing credit at 3 different auction houses, ready to replace whoever wore out in the cotton fields. This was 1836, 5 years after Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia had sent shockwaves through every slave state in the South. Turner and his followers had killed 60 white people before being captured and executed. The white planter class had responded with absolute terror disguised as legislation. Mississippi passed new slave codes that made the previous restrictions look merciful by comparison. Enslaved people couldn't gather in groups larger than 5 without white supervision. They couldn't learn to read or write under penalty of death. They couldn't own property, testify in court, or travel more than 20 miles from their plantation without written permission. Slave patrols rode every road with bloodhounds and rifles, authorized to stop, search, beat, or kill any black person who seemed suspicious. Every white man in Adams County slept with a loaded rifle beside his bed and a pistol under his pillow. They claimed this was precaution, but it was really fear. They'd built their wealth on a foundation of violence, and somewhere deep in their bones, they understood that violence has a way of coming home. The air itself felt different after Turner's rebellion. Tighter. Charged with something unspoken. The enslaved people felt it. The overseers felt it. Even Cornelius Blackwood felt it as he walked his fields, watching 347 people who had every reason in the world to want him dead. Something was coming. Everyone sensed it. They just didn't know it would arrive in the form of a 6'4", 300-pound man named Moses who'd spent 34 years absorbing their cruelty in silence. Waiting. Moses was born in 1792, right there on Blackwood land, during a winter so cold the Mississippi River nearly froze. His mother, Dinah, was a field hand who'd been worked harder than any mule, her body already failing at 23. She died bringing Moses into the world, bleeding out on a dirt floor while the white folks in the big house ate roasted duck and drank imported wine. Moses never knew his father. The whispers among the quarters said he'd been a driver, one of those enslaved men promoted to supervisor who enforced the master's will with a whip. The same whispers said he'd forced himself on Dinah, that Moses was the product of violence, and that the driver had been sold south to Louisiana before the baby was born. Whether to hide the crime or simply because he'd outlived his usefulness, nobody knew. From the moment Moses could walk, his size marked him as different. Other children his age were small, fragile things. Moses was built like he'd been carved from oak. By age 10, he stood 5'8" and weighed 160 pounds, bigger than some grown men. The overseers took notice. They pulled him from whatever childhood the other slave children briefly enjoyed and put him straight to field work, hauling and lifting and breaking his body before it had finished growing. By 15, Moses had reached his full terrifying dimensions. 6'4", 250 pounds of pure muscle, with shoulders as broad as an ox yoke and hands so large they could palm a man's head like it was a melon. When he walked, the ground seemed to shift beneath his weight. The overseers looked at Moses and saw exactly what they wanted to see, a perfect beast of burden. A biological machine designed by God himself for the heaviest, most punishing labor a plantation could offer. They worked him like they'd work a steam engine, assuming he required nothing beyond fuel and the occasional maintenance beating to keep him compliant. Moses was assigned every job that broke other men. He cleared new land, wrapping chains around his torso and pulling stumps from the earth that teams of horses couldn't budge. He operated the cotton gin, dangerous work that had already cost 3 men their fingers and 1 man his entire hand. The machinery was unforgiving, and 1 moment of inattention meant mutilation or death. Moses never flinched. He hauled the 500-pound cotton bales from the gin to the wagons, carrying on his back what should have required 4 men. He dug irrigation ditches in the blazing Mississippi summer, standing waist-deep in mud for 12 hours straight while mosquitoes feasted on his skin. He broke horses that no one else could handle, wild, violent animals that would have killed smaller men. Moses would grab them by the bridle and stare into their eyes until something in them understood they'd met something stronger. The overseers assumed Moses was simple. Big body, small mind, that was the equation they preferred. A smart slave was a dangerous slave, prone to ideas about freedom and resistance. But a dumb slave, a compliant giant who did what he was told without question? That was valuable property. They were catastrophically wrong. Behind Moses's quiet exterior, behind the carefully maintained expression of blank obedience, lived an intelligence as sharp as any blade. Moses watched everything, remembered everything, understood far more about Blackwood's operations than any overseer would have guessed or could have tolerated. He'd taught himself mathematics by observing the weighing and counting of cotton bales. While the plantation bookkeeper scratched numbers onto paper, Moses did the same calculations in his head, faster, more accurately. He knew exactly how much cotton each section produced, which fields were most profitable, what the plantation earned each season. He understood machinery better than the white mechanics Cornelius Blackwood occasionally hired from Natchez. When equipment broke down, Moses could diagnose the problem by listening to the sounds it made. He fixed things the overseers claimed were beyond repair, though he was careful to make it look like simple luck rather than skill. He knew which fields would flood during heavy rains and which would drain properly. He understood soil quality, crop rotation, weather patterns. He could predict yields weeks before harvest. But Moses kept all of this buried deep, hidden behind a mask of docility he'd perfected over decades. Because he understood something else, too. An enslaved person who appeared too intelligent was an enslaved person who'd be watched constantly, beaten regularly, or sold away to somewhere even worse. So Moses played the part they wanted. The gentle giant. The obedient ox. The man who absorbed punishment without complaint and worked without rest and never, ever caused trouble. For 34 years, he endured. He cleared land until his hands bled. He operated machinery that maimed other men. He hauled impossible weights. He dug ditches in heat that made white men faint after 20 minutes. His back became a topographical map of suffering, layer upon layer of scar tissue from hundreds of whippings, each one overlapping the last until the skin barely resembled human flesh anymore. The overseers believed Moses felt no pain. They told each other he was built different, that his size somehow made him immune to suffering. They were wrong about that, too. Moses felt everything. Every lash. Every insult. Every moment of degradation. He just learned to absorb it in silence, to bury the pain so deep that nothing showed on his face. But pain doesn't disappear just because you hide it. It accumulates, compounds, builds pressure, and eventually, that pressure has to go somewhere. 12 men controlled the day-to-day operations of Blackwood Plantation. 12 white overseers who acted as enforcers, taskmasters, and architects of suffering. Each one had their own particular methods of inflicting pain. Each one had left their mark on Moses's body and soul. At the top of this hierarchy of cruelty stood Thurston Gibbs. Gibbs was 45 years old, a Kentucky native who'd been working as an overseer for over 2 decades. He was tall and lean, with a face that looked carved from granite, and eyes the color of a winter storm. Cold, gray, merciless. He carried a 9-foot bullwhip that he'd named Persuasion, and he was known throughout Adams County as the most effective overseer money could buy. Under Gibbs's management, Blackwood Plantation had increased its cotton production by 30%. That success hadn't come from improved farming techniques or better equipment. It came from systematic terror. Gibbs's philosophy was brutally simple: work them until they drop, whip them until they rise, and when they finally die, purchase replacements from Natchez. Human cattle were cheap. Cotton was expensive. The mathematics made perfect sense. Gibbs had whipped Moses more times than either man could count. He took particular pleasure in assigning impossible tasks, then beating Moses when he failed to complete them in the allotted time. He'd withhold water rations during the hottest days, watching with scientific curiosity as the giant man staggered with dehydration. Second in command was Jedediah Polk, a 40-year-old Mississippian who stood barely 5'7" but compensated for his lack of height with explosive violence. Polk carried a thick wooden club he called the Judge, and he'd beaten at least 6 enslaved people to death during his tenure at Blackwood. Maybe more, depending on who you asked and whether you counted the ones who died days later from their injuries. Polk hated Moses specifically because of his size. Every time he looked at the 6'4" giant, he saw a living insult to his own small stature. So Polk made it his personal mission to humiliate Moses at every opportunity. He'd force Moses to his knees before speaking to him, making the enormous man kneel in the dirt like a supplicant. If Moses was even a second slow to comply, Polk would swing his club into Moses's ribs or spine with enough force to drop a horse. Then there was Beauregard Lynch, 38 years old, from South Carolina. Lynch was handsome, well-groomed, with carefully styled blonde hair and expensive clothes. He fancied himself a gentleman, though he lacked the capital to purchase his own plantation. Lynch's cruelty was more refined than Gibbs's brutality or Polk's violence. He specialized in psychological torture. Lynch had a talent for finding what enslaved people loved most, then destroying it in front of them. He'd burned a woman's quilt that her dead mother had made. He'd killed a man's dog by feeding it poisoned meat. He'd torn up the only Bible an elderly man had risked his life to learn to read. Lynch believed that breaking someone's spirit was more effective than breaking their body, though he was perfectly willing to do both. Montgomery Harris was the fourth-ranking overseer, 35 years old and drowning in corn whiskey and self-hatred. Harris stayed perpetually drunk, using alcohol to numb whatever conscience he might have once possessed. His violence was unpredictable. Sometimes he'd pass out in the fields and ignore the enslaved people entirely. Other times he'd erupt in drunken rages, lashing out with his whip at anyone within reach. He'd once given a 12-year-old girl 50 lashes because she reminded him of his own daughter, the one his wife had taken when she left him. The remaining 8 overseers were younger men, ranging from 22 to 30 years old. Caldwell, Rutherford, Whitfield, Pemberton, Hammond, Blackmore, Thornton, and Yates. They were all cut from the same cloth, ambitious, cruel, eager to prove themselves worthy of promotion to positions like Gibbs or Polk held. These younger overseers competed with each other constantly, trying to see who could extract the most labor from their assigned sections. And Moses, who was assigned to whichever section needed the heaviest work on any given day, bore the brunt of all their ambitions. He became their shared proving ground, the test of their authority. Each of the 12 had beaten Moses at various times. Each had mocked him, calling him ox, mule, beast, monster, anything but a man. Each had degraded him in ways large and small. They'd spit on him. They'd urinated on his food. They'd made crude jokes about what they might do to any woman he cared about, dangling the threat of rape like it was their divine right. They saw Moses's compliance as weakness, his silence as stupidity, his endurance as evidence that he was somehow less than human, built to absorb punishment the way a plow is built to break soil. Not one of them understood what they were really doing. They weren't breaking Moses. They were forging him. Every beating was a hammer strike. Every humiliation was heat and pressure. Every stolen piece of his humanity was fuel for something building inside him, something patient and intelligent and absolutely without mercy. They were creating their own executioner, and they'd never see him coming. In the midst of all that suffering, Moses found something he'd never expected to find: joy. Her name was Rose. She was a house slave, a small woman who barely reached 5 feet tall, with gentle hands and a voice that reminded Moses of birdsong. Rose worked in the big house as a cook and general servant, which meant she occupied a slightly different world than the field hands, closer to the white family's daily life, subject to different cruelties, different rules. Cornelius Blackwood had purchased Rose 6 years earlier when her previous master died and his estate was liquidated. She was 30 years old now, born on a neighboring plantation, and she'd learned early how to navigate the dangerous waters of serving white people in close quarters. Most of the enslaved people at Blackwood were afraid of Moses. His sheer size intimidated them, made them keep their distance as if his enormous body might suddenly erupt in violence. But Rose was different. They met on a Sunday afternoon by the small creek that ran through the quarters. Sunday was the one half-day of rest that enslaved people received each week, a few precious hours between finishing morning chores and starting evening ones. Moses had been sitting by the water, soaking his perpetually aching feet in the cool current, when Rose approached carrying a basket of washing from the big house. She sat down beside him without asking permission, her small feet dangling in the water next to his massive ones. "You Moses, ain't you?" she said. "The one they work so hard. Your feet must pain you something terrible." It was the first time in years anyone had acknowledged that he might feel pain, that he might suffer. Moses couldn't speak around the sudden tightness in his throat, so he just nodded. They sat in silence as the sun set over the cotton fields, and something unspoken passed between them. Understanding. Recognition. The acknowledgement of shared humanity in a place designed to strip it away. From that day forward, Moses and Rose stole moments together whenever they could. On Sunday afternoons, they'd meet by the creek, and Rose would tell Moses stories she'd heard from the other house slaves, tales of a world beyond Blackwood Plantation. She told him about New Orleans, where free black people walked the streets and owned businesses. She told him about the North, where slavery was illegal and a man could work for wages and keep his own money. She told him about the Underground Railroad, the secret network of safe houses and brave conductors who helped enslaved people escape to freedom. Moses would listen, drinking in every word, imagining a world where his strength belonged to himself, where he could use his powerful body to build a life instead of enriching white men who saw him as livestock. Their friendship deepened into something more. Love grew in the spaces between brutality, in stolen glances and careful touches when the overseers weren't watching. They couldn't marry legally. Mississippi law didn't recognize marriages between enslaved people. But they pledged themselves to each other in a ceremony conducted by old Jeremiah, the eldest slave on the plantation, who still remembered the African traditions his grandmother had taught him decades ago. On a moonless night, with 20 other enslaved people as witnesses, Moses and Rose jumped the broom. Moses slipped a ring he'd made from a twisted piece of iron around Rose's finger, his enormous hands trembling as he touched her delicate ones. "I ain't got nothing to give you but myself," Moses whispered, his deep voice barely audible over the night sounds. "But I swear I'm yours, till death or freedom, whichever come first." Rose wept and held him, her small frame pressed against his massive chest. For one perfect moment, Moses felt like a man instead of a beast. 18 months later, Rose told Moses she was pregnant. The joy Moses felt was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. Despite the horror of bringing a child into slavery, despite knowing their baby would legally belong to Cornelius Blackwood and not to them, Moses allowed himself to hope. He imagined teaching his son or daughter to be strong, to survive, to wait patiently for freedom. He imagined holding his child, feeling those tiny fingers wrap around one of his massive hands. He imagined growing old with Rose, watching their child grow, perhaps even living to see the day when slavery ended and his family could be truly free. For the first time in 34 years, Moses felt like he had something worth living for beyond mere survival. He had love. He had family. He had hope. And that made everything that came next so much worse. March 14, 1836. A Sunday afternoon warm enough that the creek water felt cool against their feet. Moses and Rose sat on the bank together, her small body leaning against his massive frame. She was 5 months pregnant now, her belly beginning to swell beneath her loose dress. They were talking about names, one of the few luxuries enslaved people could claim, the ability to name their own children even if they couldn't protect them. "If it's a girl, I want to name her after my mama," Rose said softly, her hand resting on her stomach. "She was sold away when I was 7. Can barely remember her face now, but I remember her name. Dinah." Moses nodded, his huge hand covering hers on her belly. "If it's a boy, I'm thinking Jeremiah, after the old man who married us. He deserves to be remembered." They were actually smiling, a rare, precious thing, when they heard footsteps on the path. Beauregard Lynch stumbled into view, clearly drunk. His expensive clothes were disheveled, his carefully groomed hair mussed. He'd been in Natchez the night before, celebrating some business success with Cornelius Blackwood, and he was still intoxicated as he weaved toward the creek. He saw Moses and Rose sitting together, saw the obvious pregnancy, saw the gentle way Moses's massive hand rested on Rose's belly, and something ugly twisted behind his bloodshot eyes. "Well, well," Lynch said, his words slurring slightly. "If it ain't the bull and his heifer, making calves for Master Blackwood. How profitable! He laughed at his own joke, a sound like breaking glass. Rose immediately stood, lowering her eyes in the submissive posture that house slaves learned to adopt around white men. Moses remained seated, his jaw clenched, every muscle in his enormous body going rigid. "Get on up to the big house, girl," Lynch ordered. "Mistress Prudence wants you to start supper." This was a lie. It was barely past noon, and Sunday supper wouldn't start for hours. But Rose knew better than to argue with an overseer. She glanced at Moses once, a look that said, "Stay calm, don't do anything, survive." Then she hurried up the path toward the big house. Lynch watched her go, then turned his attention to Moses. "You know what I think, boy? I think you getting above yourself. Thinking you got rights. Thinking that girl belongs to you. Thinking that baby is yours." He walked closer, standing directly in front of Moses. "But that baby belongs to Master Blackwood, same as you do. Property don't get to act like it got feelings." Moses said nothing. 34 years of experience had taught him that speaking to an overseer only made things worse. Lynch grabbed Rose's washing basket, which she'd left by the creek, and dumped its contents into the water. Clean clothes Rose had spent hours washing, floated away on the current. "Go get them," Lynch ordered. Moses stood slowly, his huge frame unfolding to its full height, towering over the overseer. For just a moment, Lynch felt something that might have been fear, a recognition of how easily this giant could kill him. But his pride and his racial arrogance overrode his survival instinct. "Did you hear me, boy? I said get in that water." Moses waded into the creek, which was running fast and deep from recent spring rains. He retrieved the clothes, his massive hands plucking them from the current one by one, while Lynch stood on the bank and laughed. When Moses climbed back out, soaking wet and holding the muddy clothes, Lynch shook his head. "Them clothes ain't clean no more. Rose going to have to wash them all over again. And I think that's your fault." He pulled his whip from his belt. "Take off your shirt." Moses complied, revealing the horrific landscape of his back, dozens upon dozens of old scars crisscrossing each other. 20 lashes ought to teach you not to ruin clean laundry," Lynch said, smiling. Moses positioned himself, hands against a tree, back exposed. Lynch laid into him with enthusiasm. Each strike of the whip tore open old scars and created new wounds. Blood ran down Moses's back in rivulets, staining his soaking wet trousers. Moses made no sound, gave Lynch no satisfaction, just endured, as he'd endured hundreds of whippings before. But something was different this time. As each lash fell, as the pain radiated through his body, Moses felt something shifting deep in his chest. A pressure that had been building for 34 years. A tightness that was finally reaching critical mass. The whipping ended. Lynch spat on him and walked away. Moses pulled his shirt back on over his bloody back and gathered the muddy clothes. He walked slowly back to the quarters, his mind strangely quiet, strangely calm. He washed Rose's clothes again, hanging them to dry. He sat outside his cabin as the sun set, watching other enslaved people moving about. Children playing, women cooking, men resting their broken bodies. And Moses felt something he'd never felt before, clarity. Crystal clear understanding of what his life was. What it would always be. What it meant for his child. His son or daughter would be born into this. Would grow up knowing the same pain. Would be beaten by these same men or their replacements. Would be worked to death in these same fields. Would never know freedom, dignity, or what it meant to be fully human. Moses realized with absolute certainty that he could not accept this. Would not accept this. Not anymore. Not for his child. March 28, 1836. 2 weeks after the whipping by the creek. Rose was 7 months pregnant now, her belly large and unwieldy, making every movement slower and more deliberate. She was working in the big house that afternoon, helping Mistress Prudence Blackwood prepare for a dinner party the master was hosting for several neighboring planters. Prudence was a thin woman with sharp features and eyes like chips of ice. If Cornelius Blackwood was the architect of suffering at the plantation, his wife was an eager participant. She ruled the house slaves with constant criticism and sudden violence, finding fault in everything they did. That afternoon, Prudence was particularly agitated. The dinner party was important, an opportunity to display wealth and refinement to other plantation families. Everything had to be perfect, and Rose's pregnancy-slowed pace was making that impossible. "Move faster, girl," Prudence snapped, her voice cutting through the kitchen. "My guests will be here in 3 hours, and nothing is ready." Rose tried to hurry, lifting a heavy iron pot filled with water from the kitchen hearth. She carried it carefully toward the dining room, but her swollen belly threw off her balance. As she crossed the threshold, her foot caught on the raised doorframe. She stumbled. The pot tilted. Water sloshed out, splashing across Prudence's expensive imported rug, a Persian piece that had cost more money than most enslaved people would see in a lifetime. Prudence's face turned crimson with rage. "You clumsy cow!" she shrieked. Before Rose could apologize, before she could set down the pot, Prudence grabbed the fireplace poker from its stand beside the hearth. She swung it at Rose with all her strength, the iron rod striking her across the shoulders with a sickening crack. Rose cried out and dropped the pot. It hit the floor with a tremendous crash, water flooding everywhere, soaking into the rug, spreading across the polished wooden floors. Prudence hit her again. Then again. The poker came down on Rose's back, her arms, her legs. Each blow delivered with the full force of aristocratic fury, the rage of someone who'd never been told no, never faced consequences, never learned that other people were human beings who could feel pain. Rose tried to protect her belly, curling her body around her unborn child, arms wrapped protectively over her stomach. This only enraged Prudence further. "Oh, you think that baby makes you special?" Prudence screamed, her face twisted into something inhuman. "You think I care about some slave brat?" She dropped the poker and kicked Rose in the stomach instead. A vicious, deliberate blow aimed directly at the swell of pregnancy. Rose made a sound that wasn't quite human, a wounded animal cry of agony and terror. She doubled over, trying to curl tighter, trying to shield the baby from further harm. But Prudence wasn't finished. She grabbed Rose by the hair, fingers tangling in the coarse strands, and dragged her across the kitchen floor toward the back door. Rose tried to resist, tried to pull away, but she was too weak, too hurt, too shocked. Prudence threw open the kitchen door and shoved Rose toward the stairs that led down to the ground level. Rose tumbled down the wooden steps, her body striking each one, shoulder, hip, back, head, a terrible rhythm of impact. She landed at the bottom in a crumpled heap, motionless except for the shallow rise and fall of her chest. Blood began to pool beneath her dress, dark and spreading. Another house slave, a woman who'd witnessed the entire assault from the corner where she'd been peeling potatoes, screamed for help. The scream carried across the yard. Moses was working nearby, repairing a section of fence that had collapsed during recent storms. He heard the scream and recognized the voice, one of the house slaves, someone who'd been kind to Rose. He dropped his tools and ran. By the time he reached the kitchen stairs, several other enslaved people had already gathered. They parted silently as Moses approached, their faces telling him everything before he saw it himself. Rose lay at the bottom of the stairs, small and broken. Blood soaked her dress, spreading like a stain across the dirt. Her face was contorted in pain, eyes squeezed shut, breath coming in short, agonized gasps. Moses saw her, saw the blood, saw what had been done to the woman he loved and their unborn child. Something inside him, something that had been holding together for 34 years through every beating, every humiliation, every stolen piece of his humanity, finally, irrevocably broke. He didn't make a sound, didn't cry out or curse or rage. He simply knelt beside Rose, gathering her small body into his enormous arms with a gentleness that seemed impossible from hands that size. "I got you," he whispered. "I got you now." He carried her to their cabin, moving through the quarters while other enslaved people watched in silence. They all understood what this meant. They'd all seen this before: pregnant women beaten, babies lost, families destroyed. It was the casual cruelty of slavery, the everyday violence that white people inflicted without thought or consequence. Old Jeremiah was summoned. He came quickly, his ancient body moving with surprising speed. He examined Rose while Moses held her hand, and after several long minutes, the old man looked up and shook his head. "Baby coming too early," Jeremiah said quietly. "Way too early. And there's too much blood, too much damage inside." Moses said nothing, just held Rose's hand while she writhed in pain, while her body began the process of labor months before it should have, while their child fought to be born into a world that had already killed it. The long night was just beginning. And by the time it ended, the man named Moses would be gone, replaced by something else entirely. Something that would make 12 overseers pay for every drop of blood his family had shed. Moses held Rose's hand through the labor, his enormous fingers intertwined with her delicate ones. His grip was gentle despite his size, careful not to hurt her even as she squeezed back with all the strength her small body possessed. Old Jeremiah worked between Rose's legs, murmuring prayers in a language his grandmother had taught him, words from Africa that predated the chains, predated the Middle Passage, predated this nightmare they were all trapped in. Rose screamed. Not the controlled breathing sounds that women made during normal childbirth, but raw animal cries of agony. Her body was trying to expel the baby months before it was ready, and everything was going wrong. The hours crawled past. Moses knelt beside their bed, whispering to Rose, telling her she was strong, telling her to hold on, telling her lies about how everything would be fine. Just after midnight, the baby came. A boy. Tiny and perfect, with Moses's broad nose and Rose's delicate ears. His skin was smooth, unblemished by the world. His fingers were impossibly small, each one perfectly formed. He was dead. Had been dead before he was born, old Jeremiah said quietly. The trauma from Prudence's beating, the fall down the stairs, it had been too much. The baby's heart had stopped hours ago. Moses took his son's body from Jeremiah's hands. The infant fit entirely in his palms, so light he barely registered the weight. Moses stared at his child, at what his child should have been, and felt something inside himself die. The man who had endured 34 years of slavery, who had swallowed his pride and his rage for the sake of survival, who had believed that submission could keep his family safe, died in that moment. Something else was born. Something hard and cold and utterly without mercy. Rose survived the birth, but barely. She was weak from blood loss, delirious with fever, her body shaking uncontrollably. Moses laid their dead son aside and focused on keeping Rose alive, pressing wet cloths to her burning forehead, forcing water between her lips when she could swallow. She drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid enough to ask about the baby, sometimes too far gone to know where she was. Moses sat beside her through the long night, holding her hand, watching her suffer. And he thought about submission. For 34 years, he'd done everything they demanded. He'd worked without complaint. He'd absorbed punishment without resistance. He'd knelt when ordered to kneel. He'd lowered his eyes. He'd said, "Yes, sir," and "No, sir," and had played the role of the obedient slave perfectly. And what had that submission bought him? Nothing but more pain, more cruelty, more suffering. He'd tried to protect Rose by being compliant. He'd believed that if he just worked hard enough, endured enough, caused no trouble, then maybe the overseers would leave his family alone. He'd been wrong. His son was dead. Rose was dying. And the people responsible, Prudence Blackwood, who'd beaten a pregnant woman and thrown her down the stairs, and the 12 overseers who'd created a system where such violence was not only permitted but expected, would face no consequences whatsoever. Because enslaved people had no recourse, no protection, no rights. Because in Mississippi in 1836, you could beat a pregnant slave woman to death, and the only question anyone would ask was whether you'd damaged valuable property. As the first gray light of dawn began to show through the cabin's cracks, Moses leaned down and kissed Rose's burning forehead. "I'm going to make this right," he whispered. "I promise you. I'm going to make all of them pay." Rose was too fevered to understand his words. She mumbled something incoherent and squeezed his hand weakly. Moses stood. He walked out of the cabin, leaving old Jeremiah to watch over Rose. It was 3 a.m. The plantation was quiet, most of its inhabitants asleep or trying to rest before another brutal day began. Moses walked slowly through the darkness to the equipment shed where the plantation's tools were stored. He selected a pair of thick leather work gloves, the kind used for handling rough timber and hot metal. He slipped them onto his enormous hands. Then he stood in the darkness, perfectly still, his mind racing through everything he'd observed over the past weeks. The overseers' routines, their patterns, their vulnerabilities, where each man would be at different times of day and night. Which ones worked alone? Which ones worked in pairs? Where they were most isolated, most exposed. Moses had always been observant, had always paid attention to details that others missed. But now he watched with a predator's focus, assembling all that gathered intelligence into a comprehensive plan. 12 overseers. 12 men who had tormented him, degraded him, stolen pieces of his humanity year after year. 12 men who had created and maintained a system so cruel it had killed his son and was killing his wife. 12 targets. Moses understood this would be a one-way journey. The moment he raised his hand against a white man, his life was forfeit. But he no longer cared about survival. He cared about justice, about making them pay, about sending a message that would echo through the South for generations. Push a man too far, and even the most patient slave becomes a force of nature. Moses looked up at the sky, watching the stars fade as dawn approached. In 6 months, when the cotton was ready for harvest, when the nights were long and storm clouds gathered over Mississippi, he would begin his work. And by dawn, Blackwood Plantation would become a graveyard. Over the following months, Moses continued his work exactly as he had for 34 years. He cleared land. He hauled cotton bales. He operated the gin. He dug ditches. He absorbed beatings without complaint. But everything had changed. Moses no longer thought like a victim. He thought like a hunter studying prey. He watched Thurston Gibbs make his daily rounds, noting that the head overseer always rode alone through the far fields at 3 p.m. to check irrigation ditches, work that was technically other overseers' responsibility, but Gibbs was too controlling to delegate completely. He observed Jedediah Polk's morning routine, how the short, violent man walked through the quarters at sunrise with his club, looking for any excuse to start the day with terror. Always alone. Always predictable. He noticed that Montgomery Harris spent his evenings behind the cotton gin, drinking himself unconscious where the other overseers couldn't see him and judge him for his weakness. He studied how Beauregard Lynch spent time alone in the equipment shed after lunch, allegedly checking tools but actually napping off his hangovers. He memorized which of the younger overseers worked in pairs. Caldwell and Rutherford supervised the western fields together. Whitfield and Thornton checked the stables before retiring each night. Pemberton and Hammond shared a cabin and played cards most evenings. Moses noted vulnerabilities, moments of isolation, patterns of movement. He observed that white men's racial arrogance made them careless. They never looked over their shoulders, never expected danger from enslaved people they'd beaten into submission. Moses had advantages beyond his obvious size and strength. The most important was the element of surprise. 34 years of perfect compliance had created absolute complacency in the overseers. They viewed him as a work animal, incapable of planning or strategic thought, incapable of violence. They'd never see him coming. Additionally, Moses knew Blackwood Plantation better than any overseer ever would. He'd worked every field, repaired every piece of equipment, walked every path. He knew shortcuts through the cotton rows. He knew which buildings had loose boards that could be pried open silently. He knew where shadows fell at different times of night. He knew exactly how to move through darkness without being detected. The plan formed slowly, carefully, over weeks and months. He would kill them one by one over a single night. Start at sunset with those who worked alone, Harris first, drunk and isolated. Then Lynch in the equipment shed. Then move to those who worked in pairs, using his size and strength to overcome two men before they could raise an alarm. Save Gibbs for last, because the head overseer deserved to know what was coming, deserved to die with the knowledge that his entire crew was already dead. Moses would use only his hands. No weapons that could be traced. No evidence beyond the bodies themselves. Just his 300 pounds of muscle and bone and accumulated rage, applied with lethal precision. Start at sunset. Work through the night. By dawn, all 12 would be dead. Rose recovered slowly from the traumatic birth, though she never regained her full strength. Her body was broken in ways that would never fully heal. But she survived, and Moses was grateful for every day he still had with her. One morning in late August, Moses went to the small grave behind their cabin where he'd buried their son months earlier. He'd marked it with a smooth river stone from the creek, and he knelt there for a long time, one massive hand resting on the earth. "I'm going to make it right," he whispered to the grave. "I promise you." The weeks passed. Summer turned toward autumn. The cotton matured, bolls splitting open to reveal white fiber ready for harvest. On the evening of September 3rd, Moses woke from a brief afternoon rest to find Rose watching him with concerned eyes. Her fever had finally broken 2 days earlier, and she was lucid for the first time in weeks. "You got a different look about you," she said quietly. "What you planning?" Moses smiled at her, a sad, gentle expression that contained all the love he felt for this woman who'd given him everything. "I'm planning to make sure our baby didn't die for nothing," he said. "I'm planning to make them remember us. All of us." Rose understood immediately. She'd known him long enough to read the truth in his face. She closed her eyes and gripped his hand tightly. "You do what you got to do," she whispered. "Just know I love you. Always loved you. Always will." Moses held her for a long time, memorizing the feel of her small body against his, the sound of her breathing, the warmth of her skin. Then he stood, pulled on his work clothes, and walked out into the late afternoon sunlight. September 3rd, 1836. The cotton fields were white with harvest-ready bolls. The air was hot and thick with moisture from the nearby Mississippi River. And on the western horizon, storm clouds were gathering, dark masses promising rain before morning. Moses looked at the sky and smiled. Rain would be helpful. Rain would keep people inside. Rain would wash away blood. Rain would cover the sounds of men dying. Even the weather seemed to be conspiring with him. The sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky orange and red. Colors like fire, like blood, like justice finally arriving after 34 years of patience. Moses walked through the quarters, nodding to other enslaved people he passed. No one suspected anything. Why would they? Moses had never shown violence, never shown resistance. He was the giant who absorbed punishment in silence, who worked without complaint, who never caused trouble. But that Moses was gone now. The man walking through the quarters was someone new. Someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to avenge. The sun touched the horizon, and Moses began his work. The sun set at 6:43 p.m., sinking below the cotton fields and painting the western sky in shades of crimson. Moses stood outside his cabin and watched darkness spread across Blackwood Plantation like ink soaking into cloth. The storm clouds he'd observed earlier were moving closer now, the air pressure dropping, the temperature cooling slightly. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Perfect conditions for what he was about to do. Moses pulled on the leather work gloves he'd selected months ago. They fit snugly over his massive hands, providing grip without leaving identifiable marks. Then he began walking, his bare feet silent on the packed dirt paths between cabins. First target, Montgomery Harris. The alcoholic overseer was the most isolated, the most predictable. Every evening after the day's work was done, Harris would slip away to his private spot behind the cotton gin where the other overseers wouldn't see him drinking. There, hidden from judgment, he'd nurse his bottles of cheap corn whiskey until he passed out in the dirt. Moses approached the cotton gin silently, his enormous body moving with surprising grace through the darkness. The building loomed against the darkening sky, its mechanical parts casting strange shadows in the fading light. He found Harris exactly where he expected, sitting with his back against the gin's wooden frame, legs stretched out in front of him, a half-empty bottle cradled in his lap. Harris's head was nodding forward, alcohol dragging him toward unconsciousness. Moses stood over him for a moment, looking down at this pathetic man who had beaten him so many times, who had channeled all his self-loathing into violence against people who couldn't fight back. Harris sensed something, a shift in the air, a presence, and opened his eyes. He saw Moses's enormous silhouette against the darkening sky and smiled drunkenly. "Well, if it ain't the bull," Harris slurred, his words running together. "What you doing out here, boy? Come to watch me drink." Moses said nothing. He simply reached down, grabbed Harris by the throat with one massive gloved hand, and lifted him off the ground. The smile vanished from Harris's face, replaced instantly by shock and terror. His hands flew to Moses's wrist, clawing desperately, trying to pry those iron fingers loose. The whiskey bottle fell from his lap and shattered on the ground. But Harris might as well have been trying to move a mountain. Moses's grip was absolute, unyielding. He squeezed, his fingers digging deep into Harris's throat, crushing the windpipe, cutting off both air and blood flow to the brain. Harris kicked and struggled, his boots drumming against Moses's legs, his face turning from red to purple to a dark, mottled blue. His eyes bulged from their sockets. Veins stood out on his forehead like ropes. His mouth opened and closed silently, trying to scream, trying to breathe, trying to do anything except die. Moses held him at arm's length, watching with cold detachment as the overseer suffocated. No anger showed on his face. No satisfaction. Just calm, patient observation. It took 4 minutes for Harris to die. Moses felt the exact moment life left the body, felt the struggles suddenly cease, felt the weight go limp in his hand, felt something fundamental depart. He lowered the corpse back to the ground, positioning it carefully to look like Harris had simply passed out drunk as usual. Then Moses turned and walked away, leaving the first body behind. 1 down. 11 to go. Second target. Beauregard Lynch. Moses knew Lynch's routine as well as he knew his own. After the evening meal, Lynch would go to the equipment shed where he kept the plantation's tools and maintenance supplies. Officially, he was checking inventory and recording the day's cotton weights. Actually, he was smoking expensive cigars and counting yields in private, looking for ways to inflate his numbers and impress Cornelius Blackwood. Moses approached the shed cautiously, circling around to peer through a gap in the wooden walls. Sure enough, Lynch was there, seated at a small wooden desk, a lantern casting flickering shadows across his handsome features as he examined cotton weights recorded on slates. Moses moved to the door and opened it slowly. The hinges creaked slightly. Lynch looked up, startled, then annoyed when he saw who it was. "What the hell are you doing here, Moses?" Lynch snapped. "You know slaves ain't allowed in here after dark." Moses said nothing. He simply walked forward, his massive frame filling the small space, blocking the doorway, blocking any escape. Lynch's annoyance shifted toward something else. Uncertainty. He stood up quickly, his chair scraping backward, and reached for the pistol he kept on the desk. The same pistol all overseers carried as insurance against the very thing that was happening right now. But Moses was faster than any man his size had a right to be. One huge hand shot out and closed around Lynch's wrist before his fingers could touch the gun. Moses squeezed, and bones crunched like dry twigs. Lynch screamed, a high, piercing sound, and the pistol clattered to the floor. Moses's other hand clamped over Lynch's mouth, muffling the scream to nothing more than a desperate whimper. "You remember Rose?" Moses said quietly, his deep voice calm and even. "You remember what you done to her? Dumping her clothes in the creek. Whipping me while she watched. Calling her a heifer." Lynch's eyes went wide with recognition and terror. He shook his head frantically, trying to deny responsibility, trying to communicate that it had all been a joke, just routine plantation discipline, nothing personal. But Moses was done accepting excuses. He lifted Lynch off his feet with one hand still covering the overseer's mouth, the other gripping his shattered wrist. Then Moses carried him to the wall and began systematically, methodically smashing Lynch's head against the wooden beams. The first impact shattered Lynch's nose. Cartilage collapsed, blood exploding across his face. The second impact fractured his skull. Moses heard the crack, felt something give way beneath his palm. The third impact sent blood and brain matter spattering across the shed's interior, painting the walls with gore. Moses didn't stop. He hit Lynch's head against the wall 7 more times, long after the overseer was dead, long after there was any need. By the time Moses finally released him, Lynch's head was a ruined mess, barely recognizable as human. His expensive clothes were soaked with blood, his carefully groomed hair matted with tissue and bone fragments. Moses dropped the body and stepped back, breathing heavily now, his gloved hands slick with blood despite the leather. 2 down. 10 to go. He walked out of the shed, closing the door behind him, and looked up at the sky. The storm was getting closer. He could smell rain on the wind. Moses smiled and continued into the darkness, hunting. The night was just beginning. Third and fourth targets, Caldwell and Rutherford. These were 2 of the younger overseers, both in their mid-20s, ambitious men who worked together supervising the western cotton fields. Moses knew they'd be making their evening rounds, checking the irrigation ditches before heading back to their quarters. Moses positioned himself near the large drainage ditch that ran along the western edge of the plantation, a deep channel that was currently running fast and high from recent rains. He crouched in the darkness beside a stand of trees, perfectly still, waiting. After 20 minutes, he heard their voices approaching. "I'm telling you, if we can increase yield by just 5%, Blackwood will give us both raises," Caldwell was saying. "We just need to push them harder during harvest. Work them 15 hours instead of 13. They can handle it." Rutherford laughed. "And if they can't? If they drop dead in the fields?" Caldwell shrugged, though the gesture was barely visible in the darkness. "Then we buy more. Prices are good right now in Natchez. Young bucks going for $800, breeding age women for $700. We break them in right, they pay for themselves in 2 seasons." They were discussing human beings like livestock, calculating profit margins on flesh and blood. Moses stepped out of the shadows. Both overseers jerked backward in surprise, hands instinctively moving toward the whips and pistols they carried. But Moses was already moving. Before either man could draw a weapon, he grabbed them both, one massive hand closing around each of their throats. He lifted them simultaneously off the ground, holding them out from his body like they were children's dolls. Caldwell managed to draw a knife from his belt. He stabbed it deep into Moses's forearm, the blade biting through muscle, drawing blood that ran hot down Moses's wrist. Moses felt the pain, sharp and immediate, but he didn't release his grip. Didn't even flinch. He just kept squeezing, kept holding both men aloft while they kicked and clawed and fought for their lives. Then Moses turned and walked toward the drainage ditch, carrying them both. He reached the edge and threw them in. The current immediately seized both men, sweeping them downstream. They surfaced, sputtering and gasping, arms flailing as they tried to swim toward the banks. Moses jumped in after them. His enormous weight created a tremendous splash, water erupting into the air. He went under completely, and in the darkness beneath the surface, he opened his eyes. He could see the silhouettes of both men thrashing above him. Moses reached up and grabbed Caldwell first, wrapping his massive arms around the overseer's torso, pulling him down into the cold water. Caldwell fought with desperate strength, punching, kicking, trying to claw his way back to the surface. But he might as well have been fighting against the river current itself. Moses held him underwater, his grip unbreakable, his 300 pounds of muscle acting as an anchor. Bubbles rose from Caldwell's mouth as his air ran out. His struggles became more frantic, more panicked. Then weaker. Then barely there at all. Moses held him until the body went completely limp, until no more bubbles rose, until he was certain Caldwell was dead. Then he released the corpse and turned his attention to Rutherford, who had surfaced downstream and was trying to swim away, his strokes clumsy and terrified. Moses caught him easily. His powerful strokes cut through the water, and within seconds he'd grabbed Rutherford by the leg and dragged him back under. The same process. The same inevitability. Rutherford fought even harder than Caldwell had, his youth and panic giving him temporary strength. But Moses was patient. He simply held the overseer underwater, arms locked around him like iron bands, and waited for nature to do its work. Rutherford's struggles ceased after 2 minutes. 4 down. 8 to go. Moses climbed out of the drainage ditch, water streaming from his clothes, creating small rivers in the dirt. Blood from the knife wound in his forearm mixed with the water, but Moses barely noticed. He tore a strip of fabric from his shirt and wrapped it tightly around the wound, using his teeth to pull the makeshift bandage tight. As if on cue, the rain that had been threatening all evening finally began to fall. Just a light drizzle at first, then heavier, then a steady downpour that soaked everything within minutes. Moses looked up at the sky and let the rain wash some of the blood from his skin. Then he continued toward his next targets. 5th and 6th targets, Pemberton and Hammond. These two shared a cabin near the big house, a small structure where they spent their evenings playing cards and drinking whiskey. Moses approached cautiously, peering through the window. Both men were inside, exactly as he'd expected. They sat at a rough wooden table with cards spread between them, a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses within easy reach. Their boots were off, their guard completely down. Why would they lock their door? No slave would dare enter an overseer's cabin uninvited. Moses tested the door and found it unlocked. He opened it and stepped inside. Both men looked up in shock, cards freezing in their hands. Moses was already moving. He covered the distance between the door and the table in 3 enormous strides, reached out with both hands, and grabbed Pemberton and Hammond by their heads. He slammed them together with tremendous force. The sound was like tree branches snapping, a wet crack that echoed through the small cabin. Both men's skulls fractured on impact. Pemberton dropped immediately, unconscious or dead, collapsing face-first onto the card table. Hammond staggered backward, blood pouring from his shattered nose, one eye already swelling shut. He crashed into the wall behind him, barely able to stand. Moses followed him. Hammond's survival instinct kicked in. He grabbed a pistol from a holster hanging on the wall and fired without aiming, the report deafening in the confined space. The ball hit Moses in the left shoulder, tearing through muscle and embedding itself somewhere near his collarbone. Moses grunted with pain but didn't stop advancing. He reached Hammond, grabbed the hand holding the pistol, and squeezed. Bones crunched and splintered under the pressure. Hammond screamed and dropped the weapon. Moses picked Hammond up by his shirt and threw him across the room. Hammond crashed through the cabin's wooden table, cards and whiskey and splinters flying in all directions. He lay in the wreckage, groaning, trying to crawl away. Moses walked over calmly and placed one massive foot on Hammond's chest. Then he began applying pressure. Hammond's screams filled the cabin as his ribs cracked one by one, distinct snapping sounds like kindling breaking. Moses pressed down harder, feeling the chest cavity compress beneath his weight, feeling internal organs rupture. Hammond's screams turned to wet gurgles as blood filled his lungs. Then the sounds stopped altogether. Moses stepped back and turned to Pemberton, who was still lying unconscious across the ruined card table. He walked over, placed his hands on either side of the man's head, and twisted sharply. The neck broke with a sound like a wet branch snapping. 6 down. 6 to go. Moses walked out of the cabin and back into the rain, which was now falling in sheets. His left arm hung partially useless at his side, the bullet wound burning like fire. His right forearm still bled from Caldwell's knife. But Moses felt no exhaustion, no hesitation. He felt focused, purposeful, alive. The storm had broken, and so had he. And there were still 6 more demons to send to hell. 7th and 8th targets, Whitfield and Thornton. Moses knew these two would be in the stables, performing their nightly routine of checking on the plantation's horses before retiring to their quarters. The stables were located between the overseer's cabins and the big house, close enough that screams might be heard, which meant Moses would need to work quickly. He approached the building through the pouring rain, his boots squelching in mud, water streaming down his face. The stable door was partially open, lamplight spilling out into the darkness. Moses stepped inside. The horses sensed him immediately. They began whinnying nervously, stamping their feet, tossing their heads. Their eyes rolled white with fear, nostrils flaring. Animals always knew when a predator was near. Whitfield looked up from the stall he'd been examining and saw Moses standing in the doorway, a massive silhouette backlit by lightning, covered in blood and rain and mud, something that barely looked human anymore. "Sweet Jesus!" Whitfield breathed. He grabbed for the whip hanging from his belt, but Moses was already charging. Moses came forward like a bull, his massive shoulder driving into Whitfield's chest with the force of a battering ram. The impact lifted Whitfield completely off his feet and carried him backward into an empty stall. His head cracked against a wooden support post with a sickening thud. He crumpled to the straw-covered floor, dazed and bleeding. Thornton had been at the far end of the stable. He saw what happened to Whitfield and ran for the door, screaming at the top of his lungs. "Help! Murder! Someone help us!" Moses caught him before he'd made it 3 steps. One enormous arm wrapped around Thornton's neck from behind, cutting off the scream mid-syllable. Moses applied a chokehold, his massive forearm crushing Thornton's windpipe, his other hand braced against the back of the overseer's head. Thornton clawed desperately at Moses's arm, his feet kicking wildly, trying to find purchase, trying to break free. But Moses's grip was absolute. Thornton lost consciousness after 30 seconds, his body going limp. Moses held the chokehold for another 90 seconds, feeling the moment when unconsciousness became death, when the last bit of oxygen was cut off and the brain shut down permanently. He released the body and turned back to Whitfield. The overseer had recovered enough to pull himself upright, leaning heavily against the stall's wooden wall. Blood ran from a gash on his scalp where he'd hit the post. When he saw Moses approaching, he drew a knife from his boot, a long blade meant for skinning game. Whitfield slashed wildly, the knife cutting across Moses's chest, then his stomach, then his arms. Multiple shallow wounds that drew blood but didn't slow Moses down. Moses grabbed Whitfield by his shirt with both hands and lifted him off the ground. "You whipped me 237 times, Moses said, his deep voice eerily calm despite the violence. "I counted every single one. Now you're going to understand what that felt like." Moses carried Whitfield to an empty stall. There was a hook on the wall used for hanging tack and saddles. Moses took Whitfield's own belt, looped it around the hook, and hung the overseer by his neck. Whitfield dangled there, his feet just inches from the ground, choking and struggling, his hands clawing at the belt around his throat. Moses picked up Whitfield's whip from where it had fallen in the straw. Then he began to strike. He counted each blow out loud, his voice steady and methodical. 1. The whip cracked across Whitfield's back. 2. Another strike, opening a line of blood across his shoulders. 3. Moses continued without pause, without mercy. He worked his way through the count systematically. 10 lashes, 20, 50, 100. Whitfield stopped struggling after the first 30 blows, his body going slack as unconsciousness took him. Death came sometime around strike number 70. But Moses didn't stop. He continued counting, continued striking, until he reached 237. By then, Whitfield's body was barely recognizable, torn flesh hanging in strips, bones visible through the meat, the stall floor slick with blood. 9 down. 3 to go. Moses dropped the whip and walked out of the stable into the rain. His body was screaming now. The bullet wound in his shoulder throbbed with every heartbeat. The knife wound in his forearm had soaked through the makeshift bandage. The multiple cuts across his chest and stomach burned. He'd lost a dangerous amount of blood. But Moses would not stop. Could not stop. Not until all 12 were dead. 10th target, Jedediah Polk. Moses knew Polk would be in his private cabin, the largest and most comfortable of the overseer's quarters. The short, violent man would be sleeping in his feather bed with his club called the Judge within easy reach. Moses approached the cabin and simply kicked in the door. The wood splintered under the impact of his massive foot, the door flying inward and crashing against the interior wall. Polk woke with a shout and grabbed his club from beside the bed. But he was still half asleep, disoriented, wearing only his nightshirt. Moses was on him before he could fully stand. Moses grabbed Polk by the throat with one hand and by the crotch with the other, lifting the overseer's entire body over his head like a trophy, holding him there for a long moment while Polk screamed and struggled. Then Moses brought him down hard across his massive thigh. Polk's spine snapped with a sound like a gunshot. The scream cut off instantly, replaced by a high-pitched wail of agony. Moses dropped him to the floor. Polk lay there paralyzed from the waist down, unable to move his legs, whimpering in pain and terror. "You made me kneel every time I spoke to you," Moses said, looking down at the broken man. "Called me boy, called me animal, made me grovel in the dirt. Now you're the one who can't stand." Moses picked up Polk's club, the weapon the overseer had called the judge. Then he beat Polk to death with it, bringing the heavy wood down again and again on the overseer's skull, until there was nothing left but pulp and bone fragments and blood spreading across the cabin floor. 10 down, 2 to go. Moses walked out into the storm, heading toward the last cluster of overseers' cabins. But as he approached, he saw lights blazing in multiple windows. He heard voices shouting. Someone had discovered one of the bodies, probably the carnage in Pemberton and Hammond's cabin, and raised the alarm. Moses saw Yates running toward the big house through the rain, screaming at the top of his lungs. "Murder! Someone's killing the overseers! Sound the alarm!" Moses began to run. Despite his wounds, despite the blood loss, despite the bullet lodged in his shoulder, Moses's massive legs carried him forward with frightening speed. His strides covered twice the ground that Yates could manage. He caught the younger overseer in the open ground between the cabins and the big house, tackling him from behind. They crashed together into the muddy earth, rain hammering down on them both. Moses rolled on top, his 300 pounds pinning Yates to the ground. Yates struggled desperately, managed to pull a small pocket pistol from inside his coat. He pressed it against Moses's stomach and fired point blank. The ball tore through Moses's abdomen, a devastating wound that punctured organs and would certainly be fatal given enough time. But Moses didn't need time. Only needed a few more minutes. He grabbed Yates by the head with both hands and began pounding it into the ground. Again and again, smashing the skull against the earth, driving it down into the mud until the head split open like overripe fruit. 11 down. 1 to go. Moses stood slowly, clutching his bleeding stomach, and looked toward the big house where lights blazed in every window. Somewhere in there was Thurston Gibbs, the head overseer, the architect of so much suffering, the man who had to die last. Moses began walking toward the light. Moses stood in the rain, clutching his bleeding stomach with one hand, and looked toward the big house. Every window blazed with light. He could hear Cornelius Blackwood shouting orders, hear Mistress Prudence screaming, hear the chaos of people running in all directions. Somewhere in that mansion was Thurston Gibbs, the head overseer, the man who had inflicted more suffering than anyone else at Blackwood Plantation, the architect of systematic terror, the man who had to die last. Moses walked toward the light, no longer trying to hide, no longer caring who saw him. His body was failing now. He'd lost too much blood, taken too many wounds. The bullet in his shoulder. The knife wound in his forearm. The cuts across his chest and stomach. The gunshot to his abdomen that had torn through organs and was slowly killing him from the inside. Every step was agony. But Moses would take these last steps, would complete what he'd started. The rain poured down harder, thunder rolling across the Mississippi sky like drums announcing his arrival. Lightning flashed, illuminating the plantation in stark white light. The front door of the big house burst open. Thurston Gibbs emerged first, holding a rifle, his cold gray eyes scanning the darkness. Behind him came Cornelius Blackwood with another rifle, and behind them, several armed white men from neighboring plantations who'd arrived in response to the earlier alarm. They saw Moses standing 50 yards away in the open ground, a massive blood-soaked figure silhouetted against another flash of lightning. A titan covered in mud and rain and the blood of 11 men. "That's him," Gibbs shouted, raising his rifle. "That's the killer. Fire! Fire now!" The rifles barked in unison. Moses felt the impacts, balls striking his chest, his legs, his arms. Pain exploded through his already ruined body. But he didn't fall. Instead, Moses began walking toward them, step by agonizing step, his massive frame swaying but not stopping. The men's courage faltered. They'd never seen anything like this. Never imagined that a slave could become this force of nature, this unstoppable thing that refused to die even with a dozen bullets in his body. "Reload!" Gibbs screamed. "Reload and fire again!" But Moses was already too close. He reached Gibbs before the overseer could chamber another ball. Moses's huge hand shot out and grabbed Gibbs by the throat, lifting him off the ground with one arm. The other men raised their weapons, but they hesitated. If they shot now, they'd hit Gibbs as often as they'd hit Moses. Moses began walking backward, away from the big house, carrying Gibbs with him. The overseer clawed at Moses's hand, his feet kicking uselessly in the air. The armed men followed, forming a cautious semicircle, their weapons trained on Moses, but none of them willing to take the shot that might kill their head overseer. Moses carried Gibbs across the muddy ground until he reached the whipping post, a tall wooden pole that stood in the center of the workyard, the place where hundreds of enslaved people had been tortured over the years. The place where Moses himself had felt the lash of persuasion more times than he could count. Moses pressed Gibbs against the post, holding him there with one hand around his throat. "You took everything from me," Moses said, his deep voice barely audible over the rain. "My son, my wife, my life. Everything I had, you took. Now I take yours." He began to squeeze. His massive fingers closed around Gibbs's throat like a vice, crushing the windpipe, cutting off air and blood. Gibbs's face turned from red to purple to a dark mottled blue. His eyes bulged from their sockets. His hands beat weakly against Moses's arm, but they might as well have been beating against stone. The white men were all around them now, close enough to see every detail, but no one dared get close enough to stop what was happening. They could only watch as the giant slave, this man they'd believed was nothing more than a work animal, crushed the life from their head overseer. Gibbs died with his eyes locked on Moses's face, and Moses watched the light fade from them with grim satisfaction. 12 down. All of them dead. Every single overseer who'd tormented him, who'd created and maintained the system that had killed his son and broken his wife. Justice served. Moses released Gibbs's body. It crumpled to the ground like a puppet with cut strings. Then Moses turned to face the assembled white men. He spread his arms wide, presenting himself as a target, inviting them to end it. "I'm ready," he said. "But I ain't sorry. I'd do it again. I'd kill them all again." Cornelius Blackwood raised his rifle with shaking hands and fired. The ball struck Moses in the chest, tearing through lung tissue. Other men fired as well. Moses felt the impacts, 1, 2, 3, 4 more balls entering his body. His legs finally gave out. Moses fell backward, his massive body landing in the mud with a tremendous splash. Rain fell on his face, washing away some of the blood, diluting it into the earth. He looked up at the sky. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the storm clouds in brilliant white. Thunder followed immediately after, so close it felt like the sky itself was breaking apart. Moses smiled. He'd done it. Made them pay. Proven that even a slave, even the most oppressed human being, could strike back, could exact a terrible price, could refuse to submit. His last thought was of Rose. He hoped she'd heard what he'd done. Hoped she understood that he'd loved her enough to make them all pay for what they'd done to her, to their son, to them. He hoped she would survive, would heal, would somehow make it to freedom and live the life they'd dreamed about together by the creek on Sunday afternoons. Then Moses felt himself slipping away. The pain began to fade. The sound of the rain became distant, like it was falling in another world. The cold seeped into his bones, but it felt almost comforting now, like finally being allowed to rest after 34 years of labor. Moses died there in the mud of Blackwood Plantation at 3:47 a.m. on September 4, 1836, with the bodies of 12 white men scattered across the property as his legacy. The rain continued to fall, washing his blood into the Mississippi soil, the same soil he'd worked for 34 years, the same soil that would remember him long after the big house crumbled and the cotton fields returned to wilderness. The Titan of Natchez had fallen. But his story was just beginning. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the true cost of oppression and the power of resistance, then subscribe to this channel. We're dedicated to uncovering the forgotten voices of history, the stories they tried to bury. Hit that notification bell, because next week we're diving into another tale of rebellion that changed America forever. And drop a comment. What do you think Moses's legacy teaches us today? The fight for justice didn't end in 1836. It continues. The question is whether we have the courage to join it.